There is a silence that falls over a battlefield right before a collapse, a terrifying quiet that speaks louder than the artillery barrages that preceded it. We are hearing that silence now in the Donbas. What we are witnessing in the crumbling defenses of Kurakhove and the wider collapse of the Ukrainian Eastern Front is not merely a tactical defeat, it is a historical verdict. It is the sound of a grand illusion shattering against the hard, unforgiving rocks of reality. For months, perhaps years, the narrative managers in Washington and London have curated a specific reality for you, a sanitized version of war where moral righteousness acts as a substitute for ammunition, and where the sheer will of Western liberalism is supposed to overcome the physics of artillery and manpower. That era is over. The fortress cities are falling not because of a lack of courage, but because of a surplus of delusion in the capitals of the West. I am looking at the maps, the real maps, not the ones shown on cable news networks that gloss over the grim arithmetic of attrition. The strategic retreat of Ukrainian forces from key positions like Kurakhove is not a maneuver. It is a desperate bid for survival in a war that was mathematically lost long ago. This is the breakdown of the entire defensive belt that has defined this conflict since 2014. And yet, to understand why this is happening, we cannot simply look at the trenches in Eastern Europe. We must look at the rot in the imperial core. We must look at the systemic failure of a United States foreign policy establishment that believes it can dictate the flow of history through sheer hubris. This event, the abandonment of these fortress cities, exposes the absolute limits of United States power. It is a signal event, a bellwether that the unipolar moment is not just fading, it is suffering a violent, agonizing death. To understand the gravity of this collapse, we have to step back and look at the history of American interventionism. Because what we are seeing in the Donbas is a repetition of a fatal pattern. This is not new. The United States has a long, bloody history of constructing proxy armies, filling them with promises of indefinite support, and then watching them disintegrate when the geopolitical cost becomes too high or the reality of the ground war exposes the fantasy of the strategy. We saw it in Vietnam, where the technical superiority of the American war machine could not break the demographic and political reality of the North. We saw it in the mountains of Afghanistan, where 20 years of nation building and trillions of dollars evaporated in a matter of weeks. And now we are seeing it in Ukraine. The script is identical, only the geography has changed. The establishment in Washington, trapped in the mental architecture of the Cold War, operates on the assumption that every conflict is a moral crusade and that American hegemony is the natural order of the universe. They believe that they can export the Monroe Doctrine to the border of Russia, that they can treat the Eurasian heartland as if it were the Caribbean, subject to their whims and dictates. This is the systemic hypocrisy that lies at the heart of the current disaster. For decades, the U.S. has utilized the rhetoric of sovereignty and democracy as a cloak for what is effectively a strategy of dominance. They speak of the rules-based international order, but these rules are selectively applied. When the United States invades a sovereign nation like Iraq on false pretenses, it is called liberation. When it topples a government in Libya, turning a functioning state into a slave market, it is called humanitarian intervention. But when a great power competitor like Russia reacts to an existential security threat on its own border, a threat explicitly engineered by NATO expansion, it is branded as unprovoked aggression. This double standard is not just a moral failing. It is a strategic blindness. It prevents the policymakers in Washington from understanding how the other side thinks. It prevents them from realizing that for Russia, this war was never a choice. It was a necessity driven by the very aggressive posturing of the West. And because Washington viewed this as a game of choice, a game of weakening a rival on the cheap, they underestimated the resolve of the adversary. They thought they could bleed Russia dry without getting their own hands dirty. Instead, they have bled Ukraine white. The tragedy of Kurakhove and the collapse of the Donbas front is the direct result of this cynical calculation. The architects of this war in the State Department and the Pentagon treated Ukraine not as a partner, but as a battering ram. They encouraged Kyiv to fight a war of attrition against a superior artillery power, a suicide mission disguised as heroism. They fed the Ukrainian leadership the poison of false hope, promising game-changing weapons, the Javelins, the HIMARS, the Leopards, the Abrams, the F-16 seconds. Each was heralded as the miracle cure that would turn the tide. And each, in turn, burned on the step, irrelevant in the face of the industrial scale of Russian warfare. This is the hallmark of a declining empire, the reliance on wonder weapons and technological fetishes to solve fundamental political and strategic problems. It is a sign of intellectual laziness. The Roman Empire in its twilight faced similar delusions, believing its past glories would terrify the barbarians at the gate, even as its legions grew thin and its treasury empty. Now, as the Ukrainian soldiers abandoned their positions, leaving behind the ruins of cities they were told to hold at all costs, we are witnessing the physical manifestation of the end of American omnipotence. The retreat is chaotic. Reports indicate a severe lack of manpower, the most critical resource in war. You can print dollars, you can manufacture shells, and the West struggles even to do that, but you cannot print men. The demographic catastrophe that has befallen Ukraine is the grim harvest of a Western policy that refused to negotiate when peace was possible. Remember Istanbul in 2022. Peace was on the table. Neutrality was on the table. But the West, led by the Anglo-American Axis, scuttled it. They wanted to weaken Russia. Look at the map today. Who has been weakened? Ukraine is ruined, demographically gutted, its infrastructure pulverized, and the United States, its reputation as a security guarantor, is in tatters. The global South is watching. China is watching. They see that the emperor has no clothes, and more importantly, no ammunition. This retreat from the Donbas fortresses is the Suez Moment for the NATO bloc, just as the Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed the reality that the British Empire was a spent force, unable to act without American permission. The collapse of the Ukrainian front exposes the reality that NATO is a hollow shell, unable to sustain a high-intensity industrial war in Europe. The bluff has been called. The historical precedent here is chilling. When a hegemon overextends, when it commits to a conflict, it cannot win based on an ideology. It cannot enforce. The collapse, when it comes, is often rapid and total. We are watching the gears of history grind the U.S. narrative into dust. The soldiers retreating from Kurakhove are not just walking away from a city. They are walking away from the false promise of Western protection. They are the victims of a geopolitical gamble taken by men in air-conditioned offices in D.C., who will never hear the sound of a glide bomb leveling a trench. The immediate situation on the ground acts as a microcosm for this global shift. The Russians are not just taking territory, they are demilitarizing the proxy. The strategy of meat grinder warfare, which the Western media mocked for 2 years, has achieved exactly what it set out to do: the systematic destruction of the enemy's combat capacity. The West focused on lines on a map. The Russians focused on the destruction of the army. Now the army is breaking, and the lines on the map are moving rapidly as a consequence. This is what happens when you prioritize PR victories over military reality. The West wanted headlines about reclaiming territory, so they pushed Ukraine into offensive after offensive that squandered their best brigades. Now, when the defensive crunch comes, the cupboards are bare. This is the incompetence of an imperial elite that has forgotten how to win wars, because for the last 30 years, they have only fought insurgencies and bombed undefended nations. They forgot what it means to face a peer competitor. And now, facing the abyss in the Donbas, they have no answers, only more empty rhetoric about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. But as long as it takes has arrived. The clock has run out. The multipolar world is not being born in a conference room. It is being forged in the fire of this failure. as the world realizes that the American security umbrella is full of holes. But the military collapse is merely the kinetic expression of a much deeper systemic rot. While the tanks burn in the Donbas, a far more significant war is being lost in the boardrooms of New York, London, and Brussels. This is the failure of the economic weapon, the belief that the United States could bring a great power to its knees simply by cutting it off from the Western financial system. When the tanks first rolled in 2022, the West unleashed what they arrogantly termed the nuclear option of sanctions. They seized sovereign assets, they weaponized SWIFT, and they threatened to cast Russia into the economic Stone Age. The establishment experts, the same Ivy League technocrats who planned the disastrous wars in the Middle East, confidently predicted that the Russian economy would contract by double digits, that the ruble would turn to rubble, and that the population, starved of iPhones and McDonald's, would rise up and overthrow the Kremlin. It was a hallucination, a delusion born of supreme narcissism. They believed that access to the Western dollar system was the oxygen of the global economy, and that without it, no nation could breathe. They were wrong. Instead of collapsing, the Russian economy adapted, restructured, and then began to grow, outpacing the very European economies that were trying to strangle it. This is the system failure that is keeping policymakers in Washington awake at night. The sanctions regime did not isolate Russia. It isolated the West. It forced the acceleration of a parallel global architecture that the U.S. has feared for decades. We are witnessing the real-time dismantling of the dollar's hegemony, the very mechanism that allows the United States to run massive deficits and fund its global military empire. The resilience of the Russian state in the face of this economic onslaught is the single most underreported story of this conflict. While Western media focuses on minor tactical fluctuations on the battlefield, they ignore the strategic miracle of Russian autarky and trade diversification. By cutting Russia off from the West, Washington inadvertently forced Moscow to complete its sovereign independence. They revitalized their domestic industry, they secured their food supply, and they redirected their energy exports to the willing markets of the global South. The Iron Curtain the West tried to erect has become a sieve. The oil is still flowing, the gas is still burning, but now it flows east and south, bypassing the Western insurance cartels and price caps through a massive shadow fleet of tankers that operates outside of American jurisdiction. This is a circumvention on a planetary scale. And who made this possible? It was the arrogance of the U.S. itself. By weaponizing the dollar, by seizing the central bank reserves of a sovereign nation, Washington sent a terrifying signal to every other capital in the global South. Your money is not safe if you disagree with our foreign policy. Riyadh saw it. New Delhi saw it. Beijing saw it. The result was an immediate, panicked acceleration toward alternatives. We are seeing the rise of the BRICS alliance not just as a talk shop, but as a functional economic counterweight. We are seeing bilateral trade being settled in yuan, in rubles, in dirhams, bypassing the dollar entirely. This is the nightmare scenario for the American empire. If the world stops needing dollars to trade oil and commodities, the ability of the U.S. to export its inflation and finance its wars evaporates. The retreat we see in the Donbas is mirrored by the retreat of the petrodollar. The mechanisms of coercion are failing. When the U.S. threatens secondary sanctions on Chinese banks or Indian refineries, they are met not with compliance, but with sophisticated evasion and diplomatic pushback. The global South has made a calculation. They look at the crumbling front lines in Ukraine, they look at the stagnant economies of Europe, and they look at the rising industrial might of Eurasia. They are betting on the winner. They realize that the U.S. can no longer enforce its will through economic pain because the victim now has somewhere else to go. The monopoly is broken. Consider the sheer panic this induces in the deep state. Their entire model of power projection relies on escalation dominance, the idea that they can always ramp up the pain higher than the enemy can endure. But in Ukraine, they escalated the military aid. and Russia destroyed it. In the economic war, they escalated the sanctions, and Russia circumvented them. The leverage is gone. The tool set is empty. The US is like a magician whose tricks have been revealed to the audience. The awe is replaced by ridicule. They tried to break the Russian war machine by starving it of chips and technology, yet we see Russian factories churning out missiles and drones at a rate that dwarfs the combined production of NATO. This exposes the fatal flaw in the Western financialized economy. You cannot fight a war with derivatives and hedge funds. You need steel, you need chemicals, you need energy, and you need engineers. The West outsourced its real economy to the East decades ago, and now, in a contest of industrial attrition, they find themselves bringing a bank statement to a gunfight. The circumvention is total. From the parallel payment systems replacing SWIFT to the new trade corridors like the North-South Transport Corridor linking Russia to India via Iran, the geography of global trade is being rewritten to exclude the West. This is not just a temporary workaround, this is the new permanent reality. The US forced its adversaries to build an immunity to its economic venom. Now, when Washington barks, the bite is gone. The collapse of the Ukrainian front is therefore a double defeat. It is a military defeat that exposes the weakness of NATO hardware, and it is a political economic defeat that proves the US can no longer destroy a nation that refuses to kneel. The era of do what we say or we will bankrupt you is over, and with it, the primary pillar of American imperial power crumbles into the dust of history. This strategic impotence is rooted in a profound moral bankruptcy. The West failed to strangle the Russian economy because the world refused to participate in the execution. And why did the world refuse? Because they have seen what lies behind the mask of Western benevolence. They have looked into the moral trap that Washington sets for its adversaries and its allies alike. We are told incessantly that this conflict in Ukraine is a battle between democracy and autocracy, a Manichaean struggle between light and darkness. This is the narrative syrup poured over every briefing from the White House. But this rhetoric rings hollow to anyone who has lived through the last 20 years of American foreign policy. The global South knows, with the bitter clarity of experience, that democracy promotion is almost always a pseudonym for regime change, and humanitarian intervention is merely the vanguard for resource extraction. We must look at the ledger of history, not with the rose-colored glasses of the State Department, but with the cold, forensic eye of a coroner. Look at Iraq. We were told that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, a lie manufactured to justify the invasion of a sovereign state. We were told we would be greeted as liberators. Instead, the United States shattered the Iraqi state, dissolved its institutions, and unleashed a sectarian bloodbath that claimed over 1 million lives. They didn't bring democracy, they brought chaos. They turned a functioning, albeit authoritarian, society into a breeding ground for terrorism, directly leading to the rise of ISIS. The moral crusaders in Washington washed their hands of the blood, but the region remembers. The rules-based international order apparently has an exemption clause for unprovoked invasion when the perpetrator speaks English. Look at Libya. The intervention there was sold to the public under the responsibility to protect doctrine. We were told that Muammar Gaddafi was preparing a genocide. So NATO bombed the country back into the Stone Age. They hunted down a head of state and cheered his brutal murder. And what was the result? Did a Jeffersonian democracy bloom in Tripoli? No. Libya became a fractured wasteland, a haven for warlords and extremists. The richest nation in Africa, which had the highest standard of living on the continent, was reduced to a failed state where human beings are openly sold in slave markets today. This is the legacy of Western moral leadership. This is the freedom they exported. When the cameras moved on, the people were left to rot in the ruins of American good intentions. Look at Syria. The West decided that Assad must go, and to achieve this, They were willing to arm and fund the most vicious jihadist groups on the planet. They poured billions of dollars into a proxy war that destroyed cities and displaced millions, all in the name of a geopolitical chessboard move to deny Russia and Iran an ally. They were willing to burn Syria to the ground to save it. And now they are doing the exact same thing in Ukraine. The script is identical. The Ukrainian people are not the beneficiaries of Western aid. They are the fuel for it. They are being fed into the furnace of a great power conflict that Washington provoked but refuses to fight itself. This is the ultimate cynicism of the proxy war model. It is a moral obscenity. The United States fights to the last Ukrainian, not because it cares about the sanctity of Ukraine's borders. If it did, it would care about its own, but because it views Ukrainian lives as a cheap, disposable asset to weaken Russia. Senator Lindsey Graham said it openly, calling it the best money we've ever spent because Russians were dying. He didn't mention the cost in Ukrainian blood. That silence is a deafening roar of imperial sociopathy. They have lured Ukraine into a trap, puffing them up with false promises of NATO membership and EU integration, effectively turning the country into a battering ram against a nuclear power. And now that the battering ram is splintering, Washington is preparing to abandon it, just as they abandoned the Kurds, just as they abandoned the Afghans, just as they abandoned the South Vietnamese. The consequences of this coercion are catastrophic, not just for the victims, but for the moral standing of the West itself. You cannot bomb half the world in the name of human rights and expect to be taken seriously. You cannot seize the assets of a sovereign nation and then preach about the sanctity of property rights. The hypocrisy is so thick it is suffocating. The rest of the world sees this double standard. They see that for the U.S., international law is a tool to bludgeon enemies, not a code to live by. When Israel bombs a consulate or levels a residential block, the U.S. vetoes a ceasefire. When Russia conducts a military operation to secure its border against a hostile alliance, it is a war crime. This asymmetry destroys the very concept of a universal moral order. The moral trap is closing on the West. By framing the conflict in Ukraine as a holy war for democracy, they have raised the stakes to an existential level. But because they are unwilling to sacrifice their own blood, they are exposed as cowards who pay others to die for them. And because they are losing, they are exposed as weak. There is nothing more dangerous for an empire than to be seen as both immoral and incompetent. The chaos they unleashed in the Middle East, the fragmentation of societies, the destruction of cultural heritage, the generations lost to trauma is now bleeding back into Europe. The refugee crises, the economic blowback, the loss of social cohesion, these are the fruits of interventionism. The tragedy is that the Ukrainian people believed the lie. They believed they were joining the civilized world, the garden that Joseph Borrell spoke of. They didn't realize that to the gardeners in Brussels and Washington, they were merely the hedge meant to keep the jungle out. And now that the hedge is burning, the gardeners are checking their watches, wondering how to exit the scene without losing face. This is the betrayal that stings the most. It is not just a betrayal of allies. It is a betrayal of the very values the West claims to uphold. They have sacrificed a generation of Ukrainian men on the altar of American vanity. And as the front lines collapse in the Donbas, as the fortress cities turn into mass graves, the verdict of history is being written. It will not be kind to the architects of this slaughter. It will remember them not as defenders of freedom, but as the merchants of chaos who destroyed a nation to save an empire that was already dead. This betrayal has triggered a global reckoning. The world is witnessing the dawn of a new era of asymmetric warfare, where the weapons are not just missiles and tanks, but commodities, alliances, and the very architecture of global trade. We have entered a phase of reciprocal escalation that the West is woefully unprepared for. For years, Washington believed it could dictate the tempo of global conflict, that it could turn up the heat on Russia or China and then dial it back down at will. That control board is broken. The adversaries have their own agency now, and they are moving in lockstep. The conflict in Ukraine has crystallized what was once a loose association of revisionist powers into a hardened bloc, an axis of resistance that stretches from Beijing to Moscow, from Tehran to Pyongyang. The West pushed Russia into China's arms, cementing a strategic partnership that is the ultimate nightmare for any geopolitical realist. We spent the Cold War trying to keep them apart. The Biden administration managed to unite them in less than a year. This is a blunder of historic proportions. China is looking at the Donbas and taking notes. They see that Western stockpiles are depleted. They see that the mighty NATO industrial base cannot even produce enough 155 millimeters artillery shells to sustain a medium-intensity conflict along a single front. What do you think Beijing concludes from this? They conclude that the paper tiger is exactly that paper. The deterrent value of American power has evaporated. And how is the East responding? Not by matching the U.S. carrier for carrier, but through asymmetric pressure points that the West cannot defend against. While we obsess over aircraft carriers floating bathtubs that are obsolete in the age of hypersonic missiles, our adversaries are securing the choke points of the 21st century economy. Russia dominates energy and food. China dominates rare earth minerals and manufacturing supply chains. This is the new battlefield. If Washington escalates with sanctions, Beijing can retaliate by cutting off the gallium and germanium needed for the chips in our F-35 seconds. If we threaten their banks, they can threaten our supply of antibiotics and lithium. We are picking a fight with a factory of the world while we have deindustrialized our own nations. It is a strategic suicide pact. The consequences of this recklessness are coming home to roost, not just in the halls of power, but in your grocery store, at your gas station, and in your retirement account. This is the blowback. The inflation that is eating away at the American middle class is not a weather event. It is a direct cost of the economic war against Eurasia. You cannot sanction the world's largest commodity producer, Russia, and threaten the world's largest manufacturer, China, without destroying your own standard of living. The cost of living crisis is a euphemism for the cost of empire crisis. We are paying the tithe for a failed foreign policy. The establishment tries to blame it on Putin's price hike or supply chain glitches, but the reality is that we severed the arteries of global trade to punish our enemies, and we are bleeding out as a result. The global south sees this weakness. They are not sitting on the sidelines. They are actively defecting. Look at the diplomatic mobilization. Nations that were once reliable client states of the West are now applying for membership in BRICS. They are seeking security in numbers, building a firewall against the weaponized dollar. They are engaging in reciprocal escalation of their own demanding fair prices for their resources, refusing to bow to Western climate mandates that keep them poor, and rejecting the diplomatic isolation of Russia. The U.S. sends diplomats to Africa and Latin America to lecture them on democracy, and they are met with polite nods and empty agreements. While the real deals are signed with Chinese infrastructure firms and Russian energy giants, we have lost the narrative war. We are shouting into a void. Furthermore, this geopolitical tension is creating a terrifying vulnerability in our national security. By emptying our stockpiles into the black hole of Ukraine, we have left ourselves defenseless. Military analysts know this. If a conflict were to break out in the Pacific tomorrow, or in the Middle East, the United States would find itself critically short of precision-guided munitions within a week. We have cannibalized our own readiness to prop up a proxy war that is already lost. We have exposed the hollowness of our military-industrial complex, which is great at generating profits for defense contractors, but terrible at generating volume for actual warfare. We are watching the agonizing death of the concept of full-spectrum dominance. We can no longer fight on two fronts. We can barely support one. This is the asymmetry of the New World Order. Our adversaries are playing Go while we are playing checkers. They are using time as a weapon. They know that Western democracies are impatient, subject to election cycles and short attention spans. They know that our debt-ridden economies cannot sustain a long war. So they wait, they grind, they let the weight of our own hubris pull us down. The collapse in the Donbas is the first domino. It signals that the West can be outlasted. It signals that the end of history has ended and history has returned with a vengeance, brutal, competitive, and utterly indifferent to the moral preening of the West. As the Ukrainian front disintegrates, we must understand that this is not an isolated tragedy. It is a symptom of a grand strategic collapse. The buffer zones are gone. The illusions are gone. The United States is now facing a world where its threats are ignored and its promises are doubted. We are entering a period of extreme instability, where the vacuum left by receding American power will be filled by chaos or by rival powers. The rules-based order is dead, buried in the mud of Bakhmut and Avdiivka and Kurakhove. What comes next is the law of the jungle, and thanks to the incompetence of our leaders, we are no longer the apex predator. We are just another beast in the forest, wounded, overextended, and surrounded by wolves we thought we had tamed. We are standing in the twilight of the American century. The sun is setting on the era of unipolarity, and the shadows are lengthening across Europe and the Pacific. The collapse of the Ukrainian front lines in the Donbas is not merely a military event, it is a historical marker, a point of no return. It signifies the moment when the irresistible force of American will finally met the immovable object of geopolitical reality, and the will crumbled. The retreat from Kurakhove is a mirror held up to the face of the Washington establishment, reflecting back the ugly truth of their own decline. They are old men chasing the ghosts of 1991, trying to relive a victory that has long since faded into memory. The United States now faces the ultimate choice, a binary decision that will determine the trajectory of the 21st century. It is a choice between adaptation and denial. On one hand, there is the path of realism and restraint. This path requires a painful but necessary humility. It requires the United States to accept that it is no longer the sole arbiter of global destiny. It requires acknowledging that the world is now multipolar, that Russia, China, India, and the global South have legitimate security interests and spheres of influence that cannot simply be wished away or bombed into submission. This path would involve retrenching, pulling back the overextended claws of empire, and focusing on rebuilding the rotting domestic core of the nation, its infrastructure, its industry, and its social fabric. It would mean becoming a normal nation among nations. Powerful, yes, but not omnipotent. But there is the other path, the path of hubris and illusion. This is the path the current leadership seems hell-bent on walking. It is the refusal to accept the verdict of the battlefield. It is the doubling down on failed strategies, the escalation of conflicts they cannot win, and the desperate clinging to the myth of American exceptionalism. This myth is a narcotic. It intoxicates the elites into believing that the laws of history do not apply to them, that they can print infinite money and fight infinite wars without consequence. If they continue down this road, trying to enforce a hegemony that the world has already rejected, they risk turning a slow decline into a catastrophic collapse. They risk sleepwalking into a kinetic war with nuclear powers, a war that will not be fought in distant deserts, but will threaten the very survival of civilization. The tragedy of the Ukrainian soldier freezing in a trench in the Donbas without ammunition is that he is the victim of this refusal to adapt. He is dying to preserve a fantasy in the minds of Western liberals who cannot accept that the world has changed. The fortress cities are falling because the foundation upon which they were built, the guarantee of Western omnipotence, was made of sand. The West promised a victory it could not deliver, and in doing so, it destroyed the very nation it claimed to be saving. As the maps are redrawn in Eastern Europe, the lesson for the rest of the world is stark. The era of the unconditional security guarantee is over. The era of the dollar as a weapon is over. The end of history was a lie. We are back in history now, deep in the trench warfare of competing powers. The United States must learn to share the planet, or it will break itself trying to conquer it. The retreat has begun. The only question remains, will it be an orderly withdrawal to a sustainable position, or a chaotic rout that brings the entire temple crashing down? The silence from the Donbas is the answer. The empire is naked, and the winter is coming. This is a wake-up call. We are witnessing the mechanics of a great transition. Do not look away. Subscribe to the channel if you want the truth the mainstream media is too afraid to tell you. Like this video to help the algorithm break through the censorship. I want to hear from you in the comments. Answer me these two questions. Do you believe the United States is capable of accepting a multipolar world peacefully? Or will it burn everything down trying to save its hegemony? Looking at the collapse in the Donbas, is this the end of Ukraine as a sovereign state, or just the beginning of a partitioned existence? I will see you in the comments.